Hello, good morning to all our viewers today. My name is Toby Lim. I'm a security consultant at CloudSign. And today we'll be discussing about providing an update and overview of the cybersecurity conflict that is happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, looking into the potential ramifications of the impact, as well as the potential ways to mitigate them as well for our website owners, as well as organizations both within Eastern Europe and as well as overseas. So without further ado, let's get started on this. So the first things that we must address on this is the current state of affairs. As we know, Russian forces are currently still occupying large portions of Ukraine, and many of the territories remain occupied with constant shelling, despite mentions of counterattacks by Ukrainian forces in the cities of Kiev, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv. There has also been an observed change in Russian war aims, namely in the form of regrouping, as well as also forming up and reinforcing areas such as the Donbass region, which Russian forces are alleged to actually beginning their counteroffensive. There is also, of course, worldwide economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, and as a result, the Kremlin has also responded in such by designating unfriendly countries as of 7th March. In fact, as of 1st April today, the Kremlin is also reinforcing its pledge to ask these unfriendly nations to actually pay their transactions regarding Russian oil and gas in the form of the Russian currency rubles in order to strengthen the national domestic foreign reserves as well. And of course, governments overseas are warning of the potential of retaliatory cyber attacks. Now, it's important to remember that most of these countries that have imposed the sanctions and also are designated unfriendly by Russia include the Western governments of UK, US, EU states, but also Asia-Pacific countries such as Japan, Korea, and Singapore. And so as economic sanctions worsen, especially domestically in the case of Russia, the banning of these trades, the banning of trade, exports, and these staple products are also causing consumer prices to rise significantly, almost to double-digit levels. Most recently, as well, as of 28th March, cyber attacks allegedly conducted by Russia have affected Ukraine's InfoSec region, namely in the form of its ISPs. One of Ukraine's largest telecom regions, UKR Telecom, was actually subjected to a major distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack, that happened on 28th of March. And this actually reduced the operating availability of one of Ukraine's largest telcos in terms of internet provision down to about 80% as a result of both infrastructure damage as well as cyber attacks itself. Now, the issue here also is very similar to that which occurred at the beginning of the invasion. And this actually affected a smaller ISP known as Triolen, and which was hacked back on the invasion day itself, 24th February, as well as a follow-up attack on the 9th of March. And the outages that came from this resulted in almost 12 hours of no internet access to both military and civilian users countrywide. And so these dates again coincide with the Russian ground invasion, as well as the DDoS attacks that have occurred. Now, namely, while Ukrainian mitigation efforts have of course been in play, we must also acknowledge the fact that many of these follow-up attacks still continue to happen, as evidenced by the attack on 9th March. And so this is mainly because of the internet routing equipment that has been reset by Russian hackers, both state-sponsored as well as hacktivist organizations. And this has also been further hampered by the military operations and the artillery bombardment that is affecting physical infrastructure that hosts these internet service providers itself. So before we go any further, we must also remind our viewers that the history of Russia and Ukraine's cyber warfare hasn't just been as of this year. In fact, the cyber warfare regarding these two countries has very much been in the spotlight since 2014, ever since Russia had annexed the Crimea from Ukraine. And as a result, that has caused almost year-on-year levels of cyber attacks projected by Russia onto Ukrainian IT infrastructure, namely in the form of DDoS attacks, but also web defacements, as well as ransomware that had a major effect back in 2017, known as Petya and not Petya malware. Now, the issue with this was that such effects also had spillover back into on the global stage, namely in the form of Petya, the family of Petya malware that actually propagated overseas and caused almost a devastating effect of almost 10 billion US dollars in terms of revenue lost for businesses, and affected almost hundreds of organizations overseas as well. Another main issue of this was actually an attack on the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine, which was also affected by the Petya ransomware. And so, as a result, most of the functionality of that power plant was taken offline, and actually, the Ukrainian nuclear plant staff had to resolve to manual forms of monitoring in order to keep the reactor stable. Ukraine, of course, has also not been silent about this. They have also handled this issue, knowing that Russia has over the period of these several years conducted different forms of cyber attacks, usually in the form of non-escalatory but yet disruptive measures in order to project a political presence on Ukraine itself. And Ukraine has actually responded in the form of cyber espionage attacks back towards Russia, web defacements against separatist groups in the Donbass region, as well as also leaking the emails of top Kremlin officials, namely the Surkov leaks, which happened in 2016, where almost 2,000 plus emails were actually uncovered, showing details of how the Kremlin was planning to annex the Crimea, as well as instigate the separatist movement that we are seeing in Donbass currently. And this, of course, leads us into the present day, because this is not a matter of a sudden rise in cybersecurity attacks conducted by both countries, but also something that has been propagated over the years. And of course, most recently with the conflict, the Ukraine government has made it clear that they would want volunteers from overseas, namely in the form of hacktivists, to join the cause and either defend Ukrainian infrastructure or at least place pressure on Russian authorities through the form of non-escalatory cyber attacks. So again, aside from the history, we must also look into the threat actors that are involved here. And namely, the first one, of course, being the larger nation here, which is Russia, as the Russian cybersecurity profile is much more organized and seasoned compared to its Ukrainian, as well as arguably even the hacktivist movements that are now countering Russia's cyber attacks. We must know that in the case for Russia, the number of APT groups that are actually present, both as part of the official government organizations, as well as decentralized and yet cyber criminal organizations in league with these departments. Now, as this infographic shows, we have about 4 major departments under the Kremlin, namely the FSO, FSB, SVR, and GRU. Now, some of the history of this is that departments like the FSB have actually hosted advanced persistent threat groups such as Turla. One of the oldest APTs actually known to have been operating as early as 1996, which actually just 3 years after its discovery then propagated a data breach case on US infrastructure, namely affecting NASA, the Pentagon, as well as American government agencies back in 1999. We then have the SVR, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service, which has operated directly under the President of the Russian Federation. And this has actually also been attributed to cyber operations, namely linked to the hacking of the Democratic National Convention during the elections in 2015, as well as the SolarWinds supply chain attack in 2021. So of course, again, here we have a lot of high-profile APTs that have been attributed to very well-known global cyber attacks. And of course, last but not least, we also have the GRU unit, which is the main intelligence directorate of the Russian armed forces. Now, GRU is very closely and well attributed to be linked to the Sandworm APT group, which has been responsible for a number of successful attacks on the Ukrainian power grid in 2015 and 2016. And it's well known that as well that the Sandworm group is has very much adopted the GRU's philosophy in terms of leveraging aggressive and and sometimes very destructive cyber attacks on nation states. Now, in 2019, the Sandworm Group was also affiliated to have caused almost a defacement of about 15,000 websites back in Georgia as a result of anti-Russian statements that were being made. And even now, currently, it is well believed that Sandworm is actively working towards compromising Ukrainian infrastructure and propagating further forms of destructive malware that is very similar to what we saw in terms of the Petya and NotPetya malware in 2017. And of course, we also have decentralized auxiliary cybersecurity groups or cybercriminal groups that are affiliated to these organizations, either being hired or actually being subjected by criminal proceedings to work on behalf of these organizations. So on the other side, we also, of course, have the Ukrainians who have their own cyber security posture and their own cyber profile, namely in the form of defensive measures to protect their own infrastructure. The Ukrainian government has also set up its own cybersecurity strategy ever since its independence, closely following the recent events that have been happening, but also, again, over the years, really working towards hardening its infrastructure against Russian cyber attacks. And this has often been organized under the form of the organizations you see before you on the right-hand side, both in the form of the Ministry of Defense, the National Bank, as well as the cybersecurity initiatives to promote hacktivist organizations. And this has, of course, come into the spotlight recently with the Vice Prime Minister also working towards recruiting members overseas to aid the Ukrainians during this conflict itself. Now, of course, all of this would not be without the presence of decentralized hacker groups, otherwise known as hacktivists, who are very much on the side of the Ukrainians. But as we'll see later on, the fault lines are actually starting to look towards the middle, as Russia also looks to recruit its own members and hacktivist organizations to join their political agenda. And so, as we know, these threat actors are, of course, without the mention and for the most prominent hacker group, Anonymous, which has, of course, had a long history back in 2007 with its form of internet vigilantism, which has then progressed into political activism, both on the US domestic front as well as overseas. Anonymous, of course, as we know, has gained a reputation for its political stances against government censorship, not only attacking countries such as Russia, but also Australia, Zimbabwe, even regional countries such as Malaysia and Singapore. And this has also mainly been propagated through the use of tools such as DDoS attacks, phishing campaigns, and data exfiltration wherever possible. Anonymous's self-proclaimed cyberwar has also impacted the Russian government websites with the form of DDoS attacks on even its security agencies, such as the FSB, as of early March. And even these persistent attacks have allowed for a leak of emails and files from these Russian agencies, very sensitive data that has somehow been able to be leaked by these decentralized hacker groups. And this, of course, is a testament to the danger of the threat, as well as how coordinated, despite being known as anonymous, these activist groups can be quite organized and are very sophisticated. If arguably can be comparable to the seasoned form of the departments under the Russian Federation. And of course, here we have the announcement on Twitter by the Vice PM from Ukraine, Mikhailo Fedorov, who has of course been rallying security analysts to the cause of the Ukrainians, and this has, of course, this has also raised the issue of further hacktivist groups to join this conflict as it continues to progress. So again, to cover the context of hacker groups, here you can see a very quick breakdown. This was actually arranged by a security analyst that has been posting on Twitter, and so here we can see in the yellow on the second-hand column, a large proportion of these hacker groups are, of course, in support of Ukraine. Although their individual strength is unknown, we can very clearly see at least 60% or so are actually in favor of supporting Ukraine against Russian cyber attacks. But at the same time, this also shows that in the case for hacktivist groups in Russia, most of these seem to be domestic and homegrown, as opposed to the Ukrainians, those hacker groups that are siding with the Ukrainians, which are more global and actually in a way also maybe covering from all angles from outside of Eastern Europe. And so the demographics can be very varied, as well as the diversity of attacks that can be employed. Now, a lot of these attacks, again, come through the form of DDoS attacks, but also, as we have seen in the case of Anonymous, data exfiltration is still a very prominent feature that can be used by these hacktivist groups, as well as in the form of attacks on the Russian central bank, actually, that happened in 26th of March. Anonymous was able to leak about 28 GB worth of data from the central bank of Russia, and persistent attacks continue to propagate not only there but also on the Russian Space Agency, and we'll get into that in the next slide actually. So aside from all of this, with the history as well as knowing the threat actors, we need to understand the security implications that have actually been that have come forth as a result of this. The main attack surface that we currently understand is in the form of websites, simply because of the access to the internet, which is mainstream and readily available by pretty much every citizen that has internet access. And a lot of these targets are as a result of the accessibility. Most of the hacktivist groups, as well as state-sponsored groups, have adopted a more of a widespread approach to this. Namely in the form of the Russian government has actually, and its subsidiaries in this form of cyber operations, have actually adopted more of a coordinated yet significant form of attacks, both in the form, again, in the form of DDoS, but also the propagation of malware to both signify a political presence, but at the same time adopt a non-escalatory approach to these attacks. Essentially, the motive of this is to again intimidate, but also do so in a very calculated and restrictive manner, so as not to provoke further escalation in the form of diplomatic sanctions overseas, or by other countries, or even provoke the other party into what could be seen as a full-scale conflict, both on the ground as well as in cyberspace. And so, majority of these security implications, again, for our website owners, they have to take into account that these attacks are disruption-based, and especially when it comes to small businesses or organizations that are not necessarily affiliated with these groups, we have to take into account that even temporary disruptions by such state actors or threat actors that are working independently can affect businesses, as well as a loss of confidence in whichever organization or the entity that is involved. These can include, by the way, personal websites that can host the reputations of individuals in this case. And so all of these factors need to be taken into account when dealing with this conflict as well. It is not just restricted to state actors, especially in the case of cyber warfare, especially with the chances of spillovers happening. So as a result of this, we also need to understand that while state-sponsored actors are often acting in the form of a political agenda by targeting national infrastructure, government websites, hacktivist groups have much more flexibility in looking for targets of opportunity, not just because of their political affiliation. Case in point, we have such an instance such as Anonymous actually breaching the Russian Space Institute, Research Space Institute, which has actually no affiliation, politically at least, aside from being a public entity. And Anonymous actually leaked files from the Russian Space Agency, and as well as other hacktivist groups claiming to have disabled satellite control systems. Now, all of these are not actually having an impact in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, yet these, of course, can affect both international relations as well as the prospect of space diplomacy, which often is not actually politically centric as a result of the collaboration in space. And so the Russians have actually responded to this kind of attacks by saying that any attack on Russian space assets can constitute to an act of war. And this, of course, can lead to further escalation, not necessarily provoked by a state entity, but by hacktivist organizations. So what are the takeaways from this, especially for our website owners or those who are not affiliated to political entities, is that we have to now embrace a new normal in terms of indiscriminate cyber attacks. Because again, hacktivists will look for targets of opportunity, both either in the form of organizations in target countries or pretty much any businesses that may be vulnerable to similar attacks that have been propagated against Ukraine. And within Eastern Europe as well, many of these companies do not actually have any political affiliations, and yet are still coming under cyber attacks, namely just because they have vulnerable software that is in their networks and also hosting their web servers. Again, most recently, actually on 24th of February, as of the result of the Russian invasion, it has become known as of yesterday that the US-based satellite company, which hosts satellites in Europe, came under attack by what is now known as acid raid malware. And this actually affects the internet modems as well as the routing devices that provide the internet access to European endpoints, both in Ukraine and to its surrounding regions. And so this again had resulted in the kind of 12-hour outages that have been faced in Europe, and it can affect in parts of a whole subcontinent as a result. So SANS have also come out to also mention that Russia has a number of backdoors in several countries, whether it's in the form of APTs in government agencies or industries. Remember, again, that attacks to larger organizations can still be propagated from subsidiaries as well. And so smaller companies also have to take into account their security posture and hardening their environment in response to the ongoing cyber attacks. We also had locally, in the case of Singapore, as of 1st March, where the reservation company Chope as well came under a flood of network traffic, as seen by this slide here. And actually, this was mentioned by the Chope CEO. And as we know, these hacktivists will look for whichever opportunities they can to propagate their own political agenda, or at least cause disruption for their own means, whether it's financially motivated or even simply as a matter of bragging rights. And so many of these companies have to take this into account. Again, here this was as of March 21st, where Anonymous was warning companies that again are not state related and are private entities not to do business with countries such as Russia or to do transactions with Russian affiliated companies. And this again presents the threat where hacktivist organizations can impact business operations, not just in the political sphere. Again, here's another example of defacement that happened. This is actually a resurgent hacker that had defaced the then President Donald Trump's website. And again, this is again opening the window for the case where extremist groups or groups that are not exactly concerned with the Ukraine crisis may use this opportunity to propagate their own political agendas, either against the US or a certain state actor outside of Russia and Ukraine. Now, again, what our website owners can do to actually safeguard themselves is actually staying abreast of the news, the recent events that have happened in the cybersecurity context. And one of the best ways to do this is actually to look to your local advisories, simply because they provide contextual advice and up-to-date advice, providing examples of local APTs that work within the region and how to counter them where possible. It's also important to remember that with any organization or person that is being under attack by a threat actor, the importance comes in breaking the cyber kill chain, whether it's in form of isolating your networks, hardening your infrastructure, implementing least privileges. These are the forms of approaches that can be done. And so these security measures are very important, especially for single businesses or single website owners who have budget constraints where antivirus is just not enough. And other tools such as implementing a IDS solution or even ransomware prevention is paramount to actually continuing their operations both as a business context as well as to ensure the integrity of their websites. And so it is important not to neglect cyber resilience, because the prevention is better than cure perspective is simply not enough in this case. It's not as effective simply because along with, as we can clearly see that a lot of these state actors are still being subjected to cyber attacks. And what comes more important is actually the response to these, whether it's the form of backups, or restoration services that can be implemented to keep businesses running and websites online. So again, we must consider these in the forms of the defense in depth, and this allows us to achieve a measure of security in multiple forms, not only in terms of data integrity, perimeter defense, but also in the high-level policies that organizations have to take into account, that CEOs have to manage, and at least IT managers have to control, making sure that such procedures are being done either to the letter. Incident response teams know their procedures whenever a cyber attack is in place. And so an evaluation is very important in this case. So where to from here? Well, we've seen that the Russian Ukraine cyber warfare has a high chance of spillover overseas. In fact, this is already propagating right now in the form of the warnings that have been mentioned by cybersecurity agencies in the US, in Singapore, and other governments, warning that the sanctions that have been imposed, the diplomatic sanctions, may translate to Russian aggression on the cyber front, both in terms of retaliatory cyber attacks as well as a prolonged conflict in Ukraine. Of course, the Kremlin has hit back, of course. In fact, as of 29th March, Russian officials have accused the US of cyber aggression and has pledged to actually hold those parties that are responsible accountable in accordance to the law. And this is, again, an official term, but it may again translate into form of retaliatory cyber attacks. It's important to realize that Russia has also, till date, denied its use of cyber attacks in Ukraine as well as overseas. However, of course, the international community as well as cyber security organizations have often affiliated back to them as well. And Putin is again doubling down on the statement that unfriendly nations have to pay Russian oil and gas supplies in rubles as a form of projecting its soft power and strengthening his domestic currency. And it has gone to the point where it may even be that Russian oil supplies will be cut to countries that actually do not comply. One last thing as well to note is that in the coming a few weeks, in fact, in the month of May 9th will actually be Russian Victory Day, which is actually commemorating the surrender of Germany from the Second World War. And so it is expected that the Russian government will be looking for a victory stance, or at least a position to either project to it domestically that they have actually justified the invasion, as well as perhaps this may be a pretense for cyber attacks to be conducted on both on Ukrainian infrastructure as well as overseas. And so it's very important that that companies as well as website owners stay up to date with the latest political news in order to understand what may come in the future, not only just in the form of cyber attacks, but the significance of certain dates as well. And May 9th is certainly something to be looking out for. So the website resilience is very important, and employing defense in depth is paramount to ensuring that security will continue overseas. And now, so that actually concludes our thread update. I'll actually open the floor to any updates, any questions that may be posed. Let me just see if there's anything here. I see there's one question here, which actually speaks about, the question is, what would be an economical way for managing IT security for small businesses? Now, in this case, for small businesses, as mentioned before, we have the case where budget constraints are a major issue. And so it is important for businesses to evaluate the security stack that they have in place, whether it's in the form of antivirus, looking into their endpoints, accounting for all their data in the form of data classification. It's important to realize that a lot of this doesn't actually require funds, and it actually requires a number of organization on the small businesses part, as well as looking into cyber hygiene practices that is also mentioned by the local advisories such as SingCert and the CSA. And that would be usually a good place to start. There are also, of course, the benefits as mentioned in this slide, like CISA, which is provided by the U.S. government as well. Their Shields Up approach is targeted specifically to counter the effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so it is these international advisories that provide a very granular level for every potential attack surface, be it large organizations, CEOs, small businesses, or even the common individual on how to practice good cyber hygiene and implement good cybersecurity practices to safeguard their own well-being. I see there's another question here as well. Oh, sorry, no, that's not another question. So again, I'd like to thank all our viewers for coming here today. I'll wait for another few minutes, or if there's any other follow-up questions, feel free to add it to the Q&A portion. But in the meantime, I also wish to inform that for our viewers that if they have any questions regarding the current conflict and want to learn some advice on this, they can contact us via cyberadvice@cloudsign.tech via the email provided here. And if they wish to learn more about our WebOrion suite, which is our main product for CloudSign, you can actually scan the QR code or visit the URL that has been provided here at www.weborion.io.